Hi guys, welcome back to our third free webinar organized by Chulalongkorn School of Integrated Innovation Society. Hope you enjoy our previous seminar yesterday on CK theories and application. Today is also another great honor to have one of my favorite knowledge management expert, and critical thinker, whatever you want to call it. Here in our free webinars. Dave Snowden is the Chief Scientist Officer and founder of Cognitive Edge and the director of Cynefin Center. He has pioneered a science-based approach to organization, drawing on anthropology, neuroscience, and complex adaptive system theories. He is a popular and passionate keynote speaker on a range of subjects and is well known for his pragmatic cynicism and iconoclastic style. He holds a position as extraordinary professor at the Universities of Pretoria and Stellenbosch, as well as visiting professor at the University of Hull in the Center of System Studies. He previously worked for IBM, where he was a director of the Institute for Knowledge Management. During that period, he was selected by IBM as one of 6 on-demand thinkers for a worldwide advertising campaigns. Prior to that, he worked in a range of strategic and management roles in the services sector. He started industry following a period overseas in charity works, designing and building decision support system in the early days of computing. He also is the origin of the one who created the super famous kind of in frameworks or theories that we will be able to enter to the framework today. Without further ado, I would like to give you a state. Dave Snowden, take it away, please, if you're ready.
Hi. Okay, so now I need to share screen.
Yep.
Okay, so hopefully you can see this now. Yeah.
Perfectly.
The basis of what I'm going to talk about is work I'm currently doing, which will be published hopefully next week, which is a field handbook for the European Union Policy Lab on how to manage in a crisis. So next week you'll get the field book, which is nicely designed with probably simpler language than I'm going to use today. So consider this as sort of background task to that. What I'm going to do here is to start off with a little bit of science. The approach my team adopted originally in IBM, and then for the last 20 plus years as a Singapore-based company, so not far away from you, is to actually use natural science as a constraint on social science. Now, this has been important for many years because social scientists very rarely get enough data to form any valid conclusions. This is the physicist past in me speaking. But it's particularly important under conditions of uncertainty, because at that point, whatever happened in the past is not going to apply in the future. So methods and tools which have been based on a study of what was successful for different companies or different organizations in the past is not going to create methods which handle conditions of extreme uncertainty. On the other hand, natural science, there are things about the nature of systems, things about the nature of human cognition, which don't change. So if we understand that, we can create new methods and tools accordingly. So that's kind of like the principle behind what I'm doing. So to start off with that, and we'll start off with complexity theory, which is fundamental here. And the picture here is of a bramble bush, very common in Britain. This provides a source of nutrient to me when I'm walking coastal paths in the fall, because you get these beautiful, rich, sweet blackberries. Now, one of the metaphors for complexity, and we're talking now about complex adaptive systems, which is a major field of study at the moment. The most common characteristic of a complex adaptive system is that they are what is called entangled. So everything is connected with everything else, and they contrast with ordered systems and chaotic systems. So in an ordered system, there is a high level of constraint. Everything is predictable. Think process re-engineering, Six Sigma rules, yeah? Lots of things that human beings have designed and created over the years to create predictability in their environment. And there's nothing wrong with that, where the system is sustainable of that type of constraint. A chaotic system, on the other hand, is one where there are no perceivable constraints, which means it will never last for long in humans. Somebody will impose them. And traditionally, if you look at the history of politics and everything else, people have contrasted these two conditions. It's either ordered or it's complex. And that's been an excuse for tyrants over the years, but it's also worked in large companies. If we don't have controllable processes, how can we manage is a constant, refrain. And then people bring in the consultants, they make things which actually have ambiguity rigid, and then we get into a problem. So one of the metaphors to understand a complex adaptive system is it's like bramble bushes in a thicket if you come from Northern Europe, or like a mango swamp if you come from Southeast Asia. Yeah, everything is entangled with everything else. The entanglement has grown up. It can't be fully knowable. You can't break the system apart, because if you do so, it will break it. And with that, we get into two key concepts of management. So this is from an article I wrote, which is available on our website. This is a shortened version. If you look at the etymology of the word manage in English, it comes originally from the Italian, which is the ability to handle and train horses, and in a sort of form of dressage, a highly structured approach. And the key concept here is that you can't issue KPI targets to the horse or issue instructions. You and the horse have to co-evolve. So there are multiple social traditions, there are multiple histories. You have to interweave and interface with people's own cultural traditions if you're going to manage them effectively. And that's the origin of the word manage. It then gets corrupted by the French to mean household management, which is the way it comes across to us today. And one of the things we're trying to argue here is that both forms of management are valuable. There's managing in the sense of riding a horse and training that horse. And there's management in the sense of household management, high levels of structure. So in a complex adaptive system, you ride horses. In the ordered aspects of the company, you do a household budget. So hold that metaphor, because it's going to be important. But the key thing to understand about a complex adaptive system is nothing is ever the same way twice. There are no linear relationships between cause and effect. You can't actually make predictions in complexity because there are too many interacting elements and too many interacting connections for you to ever even build a satisfactory model. So complex adaptive systems have inherent instability, but they do have dispositions and propensities that you can manage. So hold that concept. It's kind of like science number one. Science number two, this comes from cognitive neuroscience. as it's a famous set of experiments which are run. So a group of radiologists, and remember radiologists have a highly structured training, they're dealing with a limited information set. They were asked to look for cancer nodules in a series of x-rays. And on the final x-ray, people placed, the researchers placed a picture of a gorilla, which was 48 times larger than the size of the average cancer nodule. And 83% of radiologists didn't see it, even though their eyes tracked it. So this is called inattentional blindness. We do not see what we do not expect to see. And this is of critical importance in knowledge management, in strategy, in weak signal detection, in all the areas of managing a crisis, because what you want to be able to do is to find the 17% who have seen a gorilla and pay attention to them rather than go with the flow of the 83%. And just to give you a little bit more of the background to this slide, the most you observe of what's in front of you is about 5 to 10%. And what you actually do to make a decision is you blend together multiple memories. And the first blended pattern that fits, you apply. So you do a first fit pattern match, not a best fit pattern match. So one of the major issues in managing a crisis is people won't see it coming if they're not expecting it. We got this phrase we're using around COVID, it's a black elephant. That's a combination of the idea of a black swan with the elephant in the room. So kind of like we knew this sort of thing could happen, but we didn't believe it would, and therefore we didn't plan for it. That's a black elephant. Yeah. So inattentional blindness is part of what it is to be human. We actually can't avoid it. So rather than trying to train people to see things that they won't see, we need to create systematic approaches which make minority views visible when they're needed and show the overall state of how people are perceiving this. And I'll talk about this in a minute when I talk about whole of workforce, or at a state level, whole of citizen engagement, in decision support and situational assessments. So complexity theory gives us high levels of uncertainty because systems are entangled and interconnected in ways we can't know. We then add to that that if we are not expecting to see something, we won't see it. Yeah. So decision making starts to become difficult, and the sort of conventional approaches that people have taught from an engineering metaphor over the last 30, 40 years really don't work. And then the final bit of science I want to go to is a biological term called acceptation. That's a neologism. So adaptation is the linear process that you're familiar with from evolutionary biology. And so a dinosaur's feathers, dinosaur top left of this picture, evolve over time for sexual display. We kind of like know that from the recent discoveries in northern China. Turns out all the dinosaurs were feathered and the feathers were brightly colored. So the reason for that is obviously sexual display. Then a group of dinosaurs developed skin flaps on their forelimbs to better display those feathers. And when those dinosaurs fell off cliffs, they glided, so we got flight. So birds evolved from dinosaurs, but it's not a slow linear process. It's a discontinuous change when a trait which evolved for one function under conditions of stress accepts rather than adapts for something completely different. Another couple of examples to make the point. The cerebellum at the base of your brain evolved in higher apes to manipulate muscles in fingers so you could pick seeds from seed pods. It then accepts in humans to manage grammar in language. So the huge sophistication of human language couldn't have been developed in a linear way. It required this non-linear radical repurposing. And in case you think none of this is relevant, in 1945, a Raytheon engineer who was maintaining the magneto of a radar machine noticed that a chocolate bar melted in his pocket. He realized the significance. A lot of people didn't, but he realized what it meant. We got microwave ovens. And there's some lovely examples of the flooding in Bangkok many years ago, where people repurposed massive plastic bags to actually enclose their cars in garages to prevent them suffering damage in the flood. And the whole of the pharmaceutical industry is dependent on spotting side effects. Aspirin would be one example. Viagra is the famous one. Thalidomide, which actually produces a disastrous side effect, but also produces the first ever cure for leprosy. I call this small notice hints. Most scientific advance comes when people notice something that other people haven't noticed. And the same is true for venture capitalists. You look at the massively successful companies that came from nowhere, and you kind of like say, well, why didn't I think of that? And well, the reason is you weren't expecting to think of it, so you didn't see it. Yeah. So acceptation is key. And with the crisis in COVID at the moment, we got lots of examples. When we get to the bigger crises, which are to come, like global warming, acceptation is going to be key because we don't have time to invent from scratch. And there's a body of work, which I'm not going to talk about today, which is a complexity-based approach to design thinking, which focuses on a non-linear approach to design. So it combines what we already know with unarticulated needs of consumers and identifies clusters where we can radically repurpose existing technology for novel use. And if you look at the history of companies like IBM and Apple, that's actually how they got started. IBM repurposed punch card technology, Apple repurposed Next, and so on. So complexity, inattentional blindness, acceptation, those are three key elements that you need to understand in managing a crisis. So that leads me into the Cynefin framework. I'm going to go through this at a high level. For people who want more detail on this, then the Harvard Business Review article, it was the cover article in November 07, is one of the most cited in its field. I think it's in the top 10 or 20. And Complex Acts of Knowing, which is the Cynefin framework applied to knowledge management, is in the top 3 of cited papers within that field. So there's backup material here. And every March on the blog, I do an update on the framework because it does change. So you can go back to 1st of March this year or 1st of March last year and see the basic material. So what Cynefin does is, and it's drawn like this, it identifies 5 different states or domains. The first is where the relationship between cause and effect is clear. So, for example, in Britain, we drive on the left-hand side of the road. In the US, they drive on the right-hand side of the road. Clear means not only is the relationship between cause and effect self-evident, but everybody buys into it. So I sense, I categorize, respond. Where am I? It's a country which drives on the left. Okay, I'll drive on the left, and so on. And here we have rigid or fixed constraints, and we can apply best practice. And that's a familiar area to most people. It's where consultancies try and drive companies. The second type of order is where it's complicated. So here, although there is a linear relationship between cause and effect, and although there is a right answer, it's not self-evident, and it takes expertise to discover it. So here I sense, analyze, respond. I have to do something before I can categorize. Constraints are a lot looser. If I've got expertise, I'll be allowed some variation in what I do. And that's why we talk here about good practice, not best practice. So if I'm a fully qualified neurosurgeon, for example, you'll find there are different practices between different neurosurgeons into, for example, how they approach dealing with brain bleeds. Yeah, nobody's right or wrong, they're different, but a degree of variation is permitted in this space. So clear and complicated is there. Now, those are ordered systems. If you try and impose order where order isn't possible, and things like human culture, for example, can't be engineered, innovation can't be engineered, human empathy, human customer relationship, the ability to interact with consumers, these are things which are not susceptible to engineering approaches. In fact, if you try and do that, what you end up is a catastrophic change. Things become chaotic. Now, the bottom of Cynefin is drawn as a cliff. Now, you see this within companies, and it's a thing which was identified by Clayton Christensen of what we call competence-induced failure. So companies don't fail because they were incompetent. They failed because they were too competent at the old paradigm. So IBM loses its dominance in technology because it doesn't realize the focus has switched from hardware to software until it's too late. And then Microsoft take over, to give an example. So the collapse into chaos, IBM almost went bankrupt until Lou Gerstner came in, is sudden and catastrophic. And you have to act decisively to exit from that position. Interestingly, there's nothing so good as a crisis for innovation. So we get completely novel practice. Things change radically. And then we get the complex domain. This is the one I talked about earlier. This is where everything is connected, but nothing is contained. That's what's meant by enabling constraints. It's where things are deeply entangled. And the way you understand the complex adaptive system is that you do parallel safe to fail experiments around any idea which appears coherent and see what you can get working. And those experiments change the nature of the space so you can see patterns and you can move forward. You're ideally trying to move complex into complicated. Yeah, and the green area there is called a liminal zone. It's kind of like where you now can see enough of a pattern that you know how to provide structure, but you're not quite sure yet. For anybody involved in IT, this is where techniques like Scrum are at their best, right? So Cynefin isn't a static framework, it's a dynamic framework. Things are moving between domains. And most things start off in complex. To be exploited, they have to move into complicated. So Cynefin is very successful. If you go onto Google Scholar and type it in, it's now the best well-known Welsh word in the world, which I'm not quite sure whether I'm proud of or not, but it is, right? It's been used for everything from the British government trying to use it to understand the role of religion in America, to epidemic control, to very minor things about software development and so on. So it's been broadly used because what it basically argues is there is no one size fit all. There is no right way of doing things. And I partly developed it to hit the management fad cycle. You know, I'm 66 at the moment. I've lived through a lot: business process re-engineering, blue ocean strategy, learning organization, knowledge management, and now agile. And these fads come in and they claim they're universal and you should throw out everything you've done before and adopt them. I always felt that what we'd done before had value. We just reached the limits of its value, so we needed to do something different. And that's what Cynefin is about. Nothing wrong with process re-engineering as long as you're in the complicated or clear domains. Everything wrong with it if you move into complex. Nothing wrong with parabolic experimental probes if you're in the complex, but it's a complete waste of energy if you're in the complicated. So the Cynefin framework is about using different tools and techniques, but understanding the nature of the system before you choose what you choose. And then we get to the fifth domain, what's called the AC domain. And that's the domain of not being aware of which of the other domains you're in. And there are various ways we can describe that. The academic name for this space is apparetic, yeah, and that goes back to a Derrida concept, yeah, which is basically it's a state of suspended belief. You don't know what's happening, so you embrace the contradiction, you embrace the paradox, you hold things open as long as possible to decide what you should do. So the apparetic, or if you want to just simplify it, you can call it aware. Domain there, which is in green because it's liminal, it's transitionary, yeah, is actually where you mostly start in a crisis, which is what I'm going to go on to the next slide. You don't want to be confused because that means you're going to do what you feel most comfortable with. So the thing we've been developing, and this is in the EU handbook, is what we call the apparetic turn, the ability to exit from that state of not knowing, so you can choose the appropriate methods and tools. Some will be chaos, some will be complex, some will be chaotic. So if I look at that central domain, there are kind of like 6 separate moves that I can do or should do in terms of the way it works. And this is where I'm going to get deeply pragmatic. If you hit a major crisis, you need to impose constraints fast. The New Zealand Prime Minister did this very successfully. So they're actually coming out of lockdown completely at the moment because she didn't wait to find out if she needed to lock down. She did it immediately on the basis that the later she left it, the less options it would give her. So the radical imposition of constraints very quickly in a crisis is all about not necessarily knowing it's the right thing to do, but you need to create options for future. It's what we're not doing as a planet around global warming at the moment. We're still holding things to be controversial, and then we're delaying decisions. And if we don't make those decisions, it doesn't matter what happens because we'll be dead anyway. So this immediate imposition of constraints is the first thing you do in a crisis. After that, you stop making decisions in the center. From this point on, the role of the center is to coordinate. It's not to make decisions. But if you make decisions, you'll be too vested in the decision, so you'll pursue it beyond its utility. And also your energy needs to go into coordination. So it's distribute decision making, centralized coordination, but you distribute it into processes, into structure. Yeah, you don't force it into, it's not about anybody can do this. So I'll take an example we're running with the health service in Britain at the moment. Any doctor can make a triage decision, which breaks the rules, because you have to do that in a crisis, provided a nurse with 10 years experience and an administrator with 5 years experience signs it off. So what you're doing is you're creating a process which allows for rapid delegation, and you're secure in the process itself. So very fast decision making to keep your options open, then start to coordinate and delegate decision making is the key role. So you move things out of chaos into the apparatic through the aware section by the imposition of those constraints. Next thing you do is ask yourself a simple question. Did you ignore expert advice? Well, virtually every government in the world ignored epidemiologists and the World Health Organization. And so there's two responses to that. The illegitimate one is to blame the WHO and withdraw funding. I mean, that's stupid, but somebody's done it, right? The more sensible way is to say, okay, guys, we got it wrong. We're sorry. What resources do you need? Go and fix the problem. And that's what most countries did. They started to respect epidemiologists. But you are going to find that that involves a lot of hubris. Yeah, you've got to be prepared as a leader to accept the fact you got something wrong or you failed to pay attention. The third move, which is interesting, is where you don't have clear expertise, you've got conflicts between experts. So in the UK with COVID, for example, we had a major conflict between behavioral scientists who wanted to go for herd immunity and epidemiologists who knew that would be a disaster. And to be honest, our Prime Minister hummed and hawed between both options, and probably a significant number of deaths are now attributable to the fact he didn't go with the epidemiologists early. But there were two groups of expertise with academic foundation. And this is where, as a leader, you ritualize the dissent. You force them into active debate. And you sit and watch and listen and decide, is this complicated or do I need to hedge my bets? If it's complicated, you hand it over to the winning group of experts. If you need to hedge your bets, then you're into movement 4, which is taking everybody with any coherent idea about what should happen and get them to run parallel safe-to-fail experiments. Now, this is actually being done if you look at the amount of different approaches to vaccines which are going on worldwide. That's an example of this. You don't bet everything on one option. You have multiple parallel options, in terms of the way you work. And all leaders have faced this at some time in their life. I mean, I was a C-level executive for a couple of decades, and 4 or 5 people will come into your office in the morning. All of them have got good ideas. All of the ideas are supported by the evidence, but they contradict each other. And as a leader, you're expected to make a decision between them, and you can't. Within the time frame, you can't gather enough evidence. And that's actually a heuristic for complex. If the evidence supports conflicting hypotheses and you can't make a decision in the time frame available to make a decision, then assume it's complex and give the owners of each coherent hypothesis a small amount of resource to run a safe-to-fail experiment, but run them in parallel and see what happens. That uses less energy and produces faster results than more investigation. And big change in marketing, by the way, comes from this. An organizational change. There's several big shifts that come to both from complexity. One is this, the shift from design by engineering to design by multiple parallel experiments. And the other is the switch from focusing on individuals to focusing on identities, but that's for another day. If you're not confident, you know what all the hypotheses are, so you haven't covered off your bases. Well, that's where you present the situation to large numbers of people. So we've done a few of these lately. So you basically present a current factual statement about the situation which is evolving, and you present that to the whole of your workforce or a sample of your population, and you ask them to assess it in real time. We run these things literally in 5 or 10 minutes in a crisis. so that you've got very rapid multiple perspectives, and these are represented as fitness landscapes, which look like contour maps. And the value of that is that you can see dominant views, minority views. You can see where people are in agreed, which means they'll go with something, where they're not agreed, so there'll be conflict. We do a lot of this in conflict resolution in Colombia and elsewhere. But critically, this is where you find the 17% who've seen something that everybody else is ignoring. So that ability to deploy the whole of your workforce, or the whole of your citizens, as a human sensor network in real time, is also a critical counter to the dangers of big data. And I can talk more about this in the questions if you want. But you've got a fundamental question that you have to ask, right? I mean, the one thing, by the way, that you never do is move it into clear. That's where that shows as a dotted line. You don't want to do this. If anybody in your organization in a crisis is saying things like, oh, if we'd only followed the process, if you'd only done what I'd said, people like that should be fired instantly or sent to, an island out of the way, because they're going to damage things. Yeah, you need people to take a different attitude. Yeah. Your big question on this is, do you go clockwise or anti-clockwise? So ideally, you want to go anti-clockwise. You want to start off with, where do we deal with all the experts, conflicting experts, multiple hypotheses, and then you'll have a small residual for the mass sense, the mass engagement. Yeah, and that is actually very sensible. But if your crisis is imminent and existential in its nature, you may need to go the other way around. Start with a mass sense and start to focus on the outliers, because you need a crisis-led solution. And outliers, by the way, are where you get acceptation. It's where you get complete novelty. So one of the major ways out of a crisis is effectively acceptive. So that leads me on to how you manage a crisis. And I'm going to take this at a high level. And the picture is designed to say, at the end of the day, things get peaceful. Right? So there are 4 steps. First of all, you have to assess where you are. And for that, you ask 3 separate questions. Was it possible this crisis could have happened? Was it plausible it could happen? Do we have a plan? If the answer is yes to all of that, it's not a real crisis. You just implement the plan. If the answer is no to any of those, then you're in a significant crisis and you can't carry on as normal. You're going to have to reconstruct or reorganize based on the current situation. So that's what's called the adapt phase. And in adapt, there's several things you do. First of all, one of the most important things in modern strategy is to know what constraints are in play. And constraints come in different types. They contain or they connect. They're resilient or they're robust. They're internal or they're external. So there's a whole process of constraint mapping. And constraints are the one thing that you can actually manage in a complex adaptive system. So, for example, a safe to fail experiment might be to make a rigid constraint permeable and see what happens. Let some things through. So constraint mapping is vital. You should have been doing this on a regular basis anyway. It's part of what we call a new dynamics of strategy. If you haven't done it, you need to do it fast, and you need to work out which constraints you can manage and which you can't, which you should remove and which are allowing things to happen. If anybody's into Goldratt and theory of constraints, he uses constraints in a much more narrow way as things you can remove. From an evolutionary biology point of view, without constraints, you get no evolution. So those 2 theories are compatible, but they're different. Secondly, you execute the 5 steps I identified earlier. Yeah, impose constraints to increase your options very quickly, then move into coordination, either of experts, conflicting experts, parallel probes, or mass engagement. Yeah. So the 5 steps, the apparatic turn, is what you do after you've done the constraints. You then need to optimize granularity. So that means you need to reorganize. You probably need smaller units. Dunbar sequence, 5, 15, 50, 150 is a good working practice, but make them slower. It's probably more like 3, 9, yeah, and maybe 100 or so. You want to be in smaller units that can combine and recombine with overlapping members between them. Yeah, because large hierarchical organizations can't adapt quickly to a crisis, so you need to reorganize fast. The other thing which everybody forgets is you need learning to take place during the crisis. We've actually deployed journaling software to doctors for a moment, because the lessons they're learning during the crisis are going to be far more important than what they learn when the crisis is over, where politics and retrospective coherence will come into play. So one of the first things you do as a leader in a crisis is to initiate distributed learning. In Wales, we've worked with the Welsh Audit Office to redeploy audit staff who are in lockdown at home as forensic observers of what's going on in the moment, so that when we come out of it, we can plan better for the next time around. So learning is key. And then you need to engage staff. The big mistake people do in a crisis is they assume staff are passive and they communicate to them. You're better by communicating by engagement. So get some of them to keep learning journals. Engage them in the sort of mass sense stuff I talked about earlier, multiple scenario planning, multiple situation. You communicate by engagement. You don't want people to be passive during a crisis. That will allow you to stabilize it, and now we accept. The people who survive a crisis are not the people who invent from scratch, but the people who repurpose what they already knew to create something completely different. Now, this is also called apex predator theory. So when the meteor wipes out the dinosaurs, it's not the shark or the crocodile who's the next top predator, it's actually the first mammal, because the first mammals are very small, highly energy efficient, and highly adaptive. So you see this when industries go under, they're not replaced by something very large, they're replaced by something small and dynamic. That's acceptation. So for this, you need several things. First of all, you initiate an unintended consequences unit. You need a small group of people who are specifically monitoring for and exploiting or preventing, because unintended consequences could be good or bad, what's going on. And that has to be a dedicated unit, like the learning unit has to be dedicated as well, because other people won't have time. And that, by the way, is where you put your mavericks, your free thinkers, the people who you keep even though they're troublesome. That's where you want those guys. Next, you really need to be managing your informal network. Informal networks provide a fundamental scaffolding for organization. The research work I did in IBM identified that the relationship between formal and informal communities was 1 to 64. So there were 64 informal communities to every one formal one. And trust exists in the informal networks by their nature, but doesn't exist in formal systems. So starting to use the informal networks, that's also part of the reorganization. Smaller units can access informal networks bigger than formal networks. Because the famous quote from Hewlett-Packard, if only Hewlett-Packard knew what Hewlett-Packard knew. The main danger in a crisis is not the unknown unknowns, it's actually the unknown knowns. So it's the things we know which we're not aware about as managers, and informal networks know who and what they are. You now start this acceptive process. So one of the things we do, for example, is we throw together things that people already know with new problems they've got. Existing technology with unarticulated needs as basically narrative clusters, and say, why are these things linked to these things, to give people ideas. So it's the equivalent of saying to people, well, hang on a minute, that chocolate bar melted in your pocket. Ask yourself why. And that's called attentional triggering. So one of the ways you manage for scalability at Acceptation is to trigger people to be aware of connections which they would otherwise have missed, and then get them to exploit them. And those are kind of like the 3 key stages of starting to move into the final point where you transcend. You need to ritualize the end. Human beings need ritual to know they come to the end of the things. Without ritual, it's deeply problematic. And there's more to ritual and habits, by the way. But this is one aspect of it. The other thing everybody forgets is your planning and training for the next crisis should be actually starting to form in the acceptation stage. It doesn't wait for the end. You start to develop the training material and you start to develop the planning for future crises while the existing one is on. And people will be more attentive to training. We actually run human-based simulation games, for example, in which people can only fail. Because if you constantly fail, you learn more than if you succeed. So bringing training and planning to the next crisis instantly is key. And then, one of the big things we're looking at the moment is how do you find the anticipatory thinkers? What your crisis will throw out is people who are capable of making decisions which keep their options open for longer. So you need to find those people and treasure them, because they're the people you're going to need during the next crisis. And they're also probably the people you should promote and fast track. The trouble is most co-ordination corporate promotion favors bureaucrats rather than free thinkers. And there's an old adage in the army, you have to wait for 2 years of warfare before the peacetime generals die out so the wartime generals can come through. Your crisis is going to find people who are the next generation of managers, and you need to exploit that in HR. And then finally, you've never had a better chance to reorganize and to create resilience. And resilience is actually not about efficiency. It's ensuring you've got sufficient diversity that you can adapt. And I don't expect everybody to get this, but we talk a lot about coherent heterogeneity, not homogeneity. So organizations which have tried to have common values, common beliefs, common cultures are less resilient than organizations which have enough diversity they can adapt, but not so much that they're in permanent conflict. So that concept of resilience in new forms of organization is key. And then a final slide is kind of like, remember that life is turbulent, it's not static. Yeah, human beings can build constructs. These two are good examples. They can be washed away by a flood, but we can rebuild them if we kept the granularity right, if we kept the connectivity right, and if we recognize that complex systems are different from ordered systems. Okay, so what I've tried to do there is to give a very high level picture, yeah, of a process which is going to be published next week, but also introduce you to some of the radical new thinking which is coming out of this science-based approach. And hopefully I've indicated it's both theoretically rooted, but also deeply pragmatic in terms of what you do. And with that, open for questions. It's gone very quiet.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Dave, for your fruitful session. It's super extreme and intensive of the critical decision-making stuff. I mean, probably we should run the session a bit much earlier than this, so probably Thailand can handle the COVID-19 situation way better than what we are doing today.
Let's come in, Ronnie. I said some time ago, COVID is a gift to humanity. It's a chance to get stuff sorted out before the really bad stuff happens.
Okay, that's great. Okay, thank you so much. I mean,
be careful, all right?
Sure. All right. I can see the few, not a few, quite a lot of questions from the floors. And if the admin at the backstage ready, can you send the questions up so we can ask Dave directly and let him answer to the audience.
I mean, yes, you're going to get the presentation slides. I'll send those through. Yeah.
Okay.
This has also been recorded. I've done variations of this which are recorded. So if you didn't record this one, we can make other ones available.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dev. Next question. All right.
Yes, it does. What happens when we have two or more criteria? I mean, in actual fact, they probably come in threes, right?
Okay.
So we've got a major economic crisis which will follow COVID after the initial period. Yeah. And part of the problem is people aren't doing the repurposing properly. So, for example, in the UK, social credit was designed by the Conservative Party really to stop people claiming social benefit. They're now trying to repurpose it to distribute money to people, and it's not fit for that purpose. Yeah. So you need to start the design process, but one crisis will trigger multiple crises. And that comes back to the anticipatory thinkers, the people who can think about what this means. Now, the interesting thing about the current crisis is what it's shown is that money is not necessarily as a rationing device. So there was a phrase a British Prime Minister used. She said, there's no magic money tree, as a way of saying I can't give money to stuff. Well, at the moment, the British government has found magic money forests, right?
Yep.
So one of the big things a lot of us are thinking about is money the best way of rationing social services? Because it hasn't worked in a crisis. So maybe we need to rethink that. And it's that sort of radical rethinking, which actually helps you pull out multiple crises in parallel. But the stages are identical, right? You need to get that unintended consequences unit in place. You need to get the learning in place. You need to start to distribute the decision making. You need mass human sensor networks to tell you what's going on. The steps are very basic.
Great. Okay. So the next question is the Cynefin framework used mainly to organize our thinking in order to manage crisis?
No, actually, it's used. It's kind of like the standard framework within the Agile movement now to understand which methods and tools you use in software development. Yeah. So say if you go onto Google Scholar and have a look, or just search on Cynefin, you'll find it's used for a lot, right?
Right.
I think the reason it's so well cited is it was the first framework which basically said human beings have learned how to make things ordered. Sure. So we don't want complexity to be another fad. Everything we've done so far has value, but within boundaries. So you'll find multiple applications of it. I've had some people use it. Actually, there's a whole coaching movement which uses Cynefin to help people understand where they are personally on the framework, because there are different coping styles based on where you are.
Right. Okay. Great. Next question. Okay. A questions on going clockwise and anti-clockwise stuff. So can you explain or elaborate more on the idea of going clockwise or anti-clockwise?
Okay. So if you're going anti-clockwise, then you start with which experts did we ignore, and you get them involved, and that's what you really want to do, because that's the lowest risk strategy, unless you're time compressed. So if you've got enough time to think, right, which experts we ignore, which experts are in conflict, what have we got covered on our hypothesis, what's left, right? If you're in a mega crisis and you're not sure what the hell to do, you start going clockwise. So you start with involving your whole of your workforce in rapid situational assessment to identify what's stable, what isn't stable, and then you start to go clockwise again. So those are the two questions, and it's a time compression issue.
I see. Okay, great. Next question.
You can do both. But you can actually do both, and that's a more advanced way of thinking.
Okay, that's great. Next question. Do you recognize Cynefin framework will withstand the test of times and remain the same in the future?
Well, it hasn't remained the same during its lifetime. I think one of the strengths of Cynefin is I've modified it as I found new theory and new practice. So the liminal stuff was added a year ago. Aporetic was added this year. So Cynefin is an evolving framework. The thing which underpins it, though, is basic physics, all right? So there are ordered systems, there are complex systems, and there are chaotic systems, and there are phase transitions between the three. And I think the whole of Cynefin and the associated methods and tools are all founded in natural sciences. So we never do case studies. When I publish the book, it won't have, I studied these 50 companies and these are my conclusions. It will be this what the science says, and this is what it means.
Right.
So it's called praxis is a technical name for it. It's science-informed practice. So it scales. So I think although the Cynefin may change a bit, right? It will stay the same in future because it's based on natural science. It's not based on social science.
Good answer. Okay, great. Next question. How does culture affect our approach to crisis? Should approach to crisis management be different in the different cultures or countries?
Yeah, and I think different cultures are manipulated in different ways. I mean, the level, I mean, what a crisis will do, it will pull out any nascent conflict which already exists. I mean, a crisis is more likely to increase conflict. You can see that in the States at the moment. You can see it in the massive movement on, black rights in a sense, right? In that you've now got people who are basically saying, look, I know it's at risk to go on a demonstration, but this is an existential thing to my background and culture. So culture is fascinating, right? The thing you need to understand is you can't engineer cultures. We map cultures by gathering people's what are called sacred stories. So what story would you tell your children about your life? maps generated from those, or what story would you tell your best friend if they were offered a job in your company? Yeah, that's the raw material for understanding culture, and you can nudge culture, but you can't engineer it. Also, there's a need for matching. I mean, I've studied a lot of history, all right? The parallels between the Weimar Republic in Germany before the assumption of Hitler is almost identically being paralleled in the UK and the US at the moment. Almost identical, one for one, both in culture and events. And that's actually really scary, right? And some cultures encourage learning, some don't. Some cultures encourage art. And I'm throwing ideas out here, but we know, for example, that painting and music comes before language in human evolution. And we think the reason for that is that arts allow you to accept. So abstraction means you disconnect from the material, so you see novel connections. So cultures which are entirely focused on STEM education, they're going to have a problem because they're reducing innovative capacity.
Right.
We know that the whole concept of the numinous, the role of religion to create identity, is actually pretty key for humans. All human beings are religious. Richard Dawkins is creating a new religion in which he's the first prophet. It's called scientism. So, you know, those will determine how people see the world. And then there's this massive divide between atomistic cultures, Northern Europe, North America, and communitarian cultures, the rest of the world, including Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. Right. So do you think the individual is prime, or do you think the community is prime? And that's a fundamental divide. And the good thing is the natural science backs up those of us who are communitarian. But the political structures are still atomistic, and neoliberalism continues to pervade. Despite the fact that one thing COVID has showed is that free market economics does not work. I mean, if there was ever evidence of it, it's COVID.
Exactly. All right. Okay. Great. Next question is about design thinking and complexity. The audience asks that you mentioned design thinking and complexity very briefly. Can you explain how would you adapt or integrate this design thinking?
The whole body stuff on this. Design thinking with a double diamond is linear.
Right.
So what actually happens is you get expert ethnography followed by engagement discussion, then you get expert ideation, you get a product. It's good for product design. Where you've got known. We add 3 elements to that. So we add in unarticulated need mapping. So how do you find things that people actually would need, but they don't know they need? And that's a speciality. How do you do distributed ideation? And then this whole absence of acceptation, how do you associate what you know with the unarticulated needs? Right. So that changes the dimension considerably. And there are now courses and methods and tools associated with this. We developed it over 2 years with people from Stanford and MIT and elsewhere. But there's generally, most design schools do not like IDEO. Okay. Because the idea that you can industrialize design with a simple training course is you can't, mate. All right? It doesn't work like that.
That's true. That's true. Totally agree. Okay, next. What is the biggest mistake of American government in crisis management at this moment?
Well, there isn't an American government. I mean, you're getting a blue and red fragmentation. And you've got fragmentation within it. I mean, so Trump is making claims that he can't go through on governance. I mean, you have to remember the American Constitution was written to prevent any type of centralized government.
Yep.
Which is why America has the biggest problem with being a massive pollutant. I mean, China is probably more capable of handling global warming than America. And America has lost its leadership. I mean, even if Trump, pray God, Trump doesn't get elected again. But even if he doesn't get elected, America will never be trusted in quite the same way. So Europe will start to reorientate towards China. Yeah, because it's got to hedge its bets on that. And we really need to think institutions like WHO and UN at the moment are more critical than they ever were.
Okay.
So I think, to be honest, I think America got it. They were right to split from England, all right? So I am Welsh. We were the first colony.
No offense.
If you don't know, it's 2/3 of the signatories of the Welsh Declaration, of the American Declaration of Independence had Welsh blood in them, all right? So we're natural rebels. But their constitution was written at exactly the wrong time in history. It celebrated the individual and it refused government. And that's going to be a major problem for them going forward. I think you'll see a break. I think red and blue will be separate conglomerations of states. And you can already see people in cities in the middle of red states who are actually moving to blue states.
Yep. Okay, good answer. All right. Okay, next, I think it's second to last. Decision in the complex system seem to contrast with a game theory where function of utility has to be explicit identified.
Yeah, the issue with game theory is it's that the constraints are knowable in games. I mean, you can contrast Go with chess. So Go is more interesting than chess. And remember that although AI can now beat a Go player, if you take away one piece, the AI can't beat the human player anymore. Human beings are more adaptive. So there is a danger in that game theory, which is effectively it's a contained environment, so you can learn from it. It's like all the models you see, all right? But they don't handle the absolute uncertainty. When we use games, we use human games masters in metaphorical settings. So we increase the uncertainty radically over traditional games. And the games masters can change the rules as the game progresses.
Right. Good. Okay, I think so. We move to the last questions. 1 second. Let me just get it out.
I hope so. I mean, I think one of the things I studied back in the 70s when I was working on indigenous communities in Northern Australia, where it was genocide, not racism, by the way, against the Aboriginal population, was the concept of gifting is almost a universal, and you can see it in modern society. So a gift is not an exchange. You don't put favors in the favor bank. So the whole point about gifting is it's an entry fee. If you gift, you're a member of a clan, the clan will look after you. But gifts aren't proportional to benefit. And there's no reason, if you think about it, why we shouldn't give free at the point of entry healthcare, education to anybody in the world. We just choose to ration it with money, and that's a human choice. And I think we've got to start to rethink this, because the other concept we've got to bring in is the concept of sacrifice. Yeah, in Bangkok, there's the high probability within the next 20 to 30 years that you'll have to be in air conditioning for 2 or 3 hours of the day, or you'll die. Yeah, that's going to happen for certain in Malaysia, possibly in Bangkok, definitely in Singapore. That's what's happening with global warming, right? So we've got to think now about the concept of sacrifice. And as long as you've got a means of exchange, controlling the means of exchange is more important than the thing it represents. So money and blockchain both have the same problem, whereas gifting doesn't. So I think there's a genuine opportunity. And there are some really good economists, most of them are actually women, rethinking this at the moment at UCL, at Oxford, and elsewhere. It's worth following. Okay.
Thank you, Dave, for your fruitful session today. It's the feeling is like, sitting in your class again back, 8-9 years ago. it's always great to listen to your.
Good for the soul, Ronnie. Good for the soul. Yeah.
Certainly. All right. Thank you, Jeff, so much. I hope you guys enjoy the sessions. Please stay tuned in our Facebook and subscribe to our Facebook as well. We're pretty sure that publish a lot of free webinar to public domain continuously. All right, I let you go back to. Oh, I like all the glasses in your background, Jeff.
Yeah, Starbucks City mugs.
Nice.
Every city I've been at, I've got one.
Nice. Where's Bangkok?
Yeah, it's up there. It's actually on that shelf. But that's only 30% of the collection. It goes around the other 2 walls. Yeah.
Sure. All right. Okay. So thank you so much, and have a nice day, Dave. I hope to talk to you again soon. All right.
Bye.
Cheers, mate. All right, guys. Thank you so much. Hope you enjoyed the sessions. We will post the record video on YouTube again in the short notice. And also, if you have any more questions, please do ask. Either in our Facebook page or in the YouTube link that you will receive. We will soon answer your questions from Dave. Okay. Thank you so much. Hope you enjoy the days and have a good night. Enjoy your dinners and a glass of beers and stuff. All right. Good night. Thank you. Bye.